Hey, welcome to Hear God's Word. This is Michael Longer. In this podcast, we study and dissect the Bible to better understand what it means and is trying to say. We'll cover theology and dig into the original meaning through language and word studies. We'll even discuss scientific and historical ties, but we'll always come back to the basics. There's so many layers to the Bible, and it's all important. So, if you want to hear what God has to say, then let's dive in. Hey everyone, wanted to start off this episode actually by making a quick announcement. Even though I usually don't do them, it's particularly related to this podcast because I finally was able to get this show up on YouTube. So if you've been listening on whatever platform you're on right now and you want to switch over to YouTube, that's now another avenue that is available. So it's on almost every major podcasting platform now, which hopefully helps everyone out. So with that said, we're going to jump into what we're talking about today, and we're going to jump into Genesis 4. We finally finished chapter 3, and that was the end of the fall story, which the fall story is Adam and Eve in the garden sinning and eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then from there, they were confronted by God, and then they were punished as well as the serpent, and they were sent out of the garden. So now the people settled east of the Garden of Eden. And so this is where we pick up the story. And I kind of gave a little bit of a hint at it before. We were talking about childbearing and all with Eve when we were talking about that, and it being a little bit of a hint, and how she'd be the mother of all life. That obviously is pointing to the fact that she's about to be a mother. So let's read this first verse and then we'll go ahead and stop. Usually we read the whole thing, but let's change up the style because there's so many different ways to have techniques in Bible studying and reading. So it says, "And Adam and Eve knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord." So let's talk about that to begin with. I wanted to read the King James so that we could tackle understanding things that are not too difficult to understand and we can put two and two together, but not everyone might understand it at first or pick it up. So it says, "And Adam knew Eve, his wife." Well, of course they knew each other, obviously. They're husband and wife. How could they not know each other, right? Well, that's not actually what it's talking about. It's actually talking about sex. So Adam and Eve had sex together, and a way of them basically censoring that sort of terminology was saying that so and so knew so and so. If you have language like that, it basically means they're intimate together. And we have different ways of saying that in English. And I think most languages have censored ways of saying, yeah, I had sex. We say, oh, so and so was intimate with this person, or, they laid down with this person, or there's so many different ways to soften the term. But yeah, let's just be blunt and straightforward about it. They had sex, and then it says Eve got pregnant, or conceived and then gave birth to a son named Cain. And then it shows Eve commenting on her son Cain, and she said, "The Lord's given us a boy." And if you literally translated it, it would be, I've acquired a man from Yahweh. So essentially, that translates to Yahweh, like the Lord gave me a man or a boy. So essentially, I'm a male child. So the first kid to ever be born and at least recorded is Cain. And so he's the first child that ever had the privilege of being born. So is it going to be a good thing or a bad thing? Well, also, let's go back and remember that it said the pregnancy was going to be painful. Is there any hint of that here? It doesn't really show, but we can assume that Eve's pregnancy probably was just as painful as every other woman's who's ever experienced pregnancy, because it seems as if that level of pain started from the very beginning. Like, even if her body was in better condition, it seems as if it still would have operated the same way. So I know that there's the possibility that the human anatomy could have been different. And I know that there's a lot of people researching early human and archaeological sort of stuff, reconstructing the body in the ancient past. And there's even sort of theories about other branches of humans, which um, at the same time, uh, I at least take those things with a grain of salt. Because even if there are other sort of human type species or creatures that fit into what we consider homo dots, at the same time, we do not know everything about the fossil records, and we don't have an accurate history. We're trying to reconstruct, and scientists are doing their best to rediscover history. Yet at the same time, it should corroborate with the history that we have in the Bible. Of course, the Bible doesn't record everything, but neither do all of the archaeological finds, and the greatest minds in history haven't found all of the details, and the diagrams and charts and things that a lot of the professionals write up are still theories, and they're very widely accepted theories in some camps. But at the same time, we could bring experts from different sides of opinions onto the show to debate all day, and probably no one would come to an agreement. So, with that, let's keep on taking what the Bible is saying. And so now we have the first people, they have their first son, and Adam and Eve's first son is Cain. And I'll give a heads up and hint that most of the family lines are going to be traced through the firstborn sons, or the men in the family that became leaders of clans. That's because it was a patriarchal kind of society at that point in time, and it still even is in other places of the world today. But I'm just giving a little bit of a tip so that you can be aware and not be confused when there are not many, or many times any, women mentioned in the accounts. So there's one thing I wanted to point out, and that's the fact that God's actual name is used here. Even though Adam and Eve and future people like Noah and Abraham and all them may not have actually known his name as Yahweh for two different reasons. One, because they probably had a different language back then. Plus, there is a verse in Exodus 6:3 that talks about how no one knew of his name Yahweh until the time of Moses, which is not until the sequel book of Genesis. In that verse in Exodus 6:3, it actually says that the people early on, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to follow, they called him God Almighty. So that's possibly what he was called to Adam and Eve and Cain and all of these people. However, it's possible that they just referred to him as God since they probably had a different language back then, as opposed to how Yahweh is essentially Hebrew in one sense, but it is still God's name. However, it started when there was already the Hebrew language. So since God's name is Yahweh, and the first scriptures of the Israelites were written in Hebrew. By default, that makes God's name kind of Hebrew, but at the same time, it's transcendent beyond any language since God's name has always been God's name before he even revealed it to them. So it was just introduced first by and into and through the Hebrew language. So with that, they called God whatever they called him back at that point. And the reason I was going to mention all of these things is just because it's trying to let you what God they were interacting with. It wasn't the gods that gave them the child. It was Yahweh himself, the God who created everything. They already and still had a relationship with the one true God, even if they didn't know him by name. With that said, we have Cain, he's the firstborn, and now we come on to verse 2. So we read the first verse in the King James. Now we'll switch over to the New King James. It says, "Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground." So here we have now two brothers. We have Cain and Abel, and you've probably heard the story of Cain and Abel. And I'm not going to spoil what happens because that's going to be talked about in next week. So we're just going to talk about the brothers and we're going to talk about something else. And we're going to go over that initial part of their life before jumping to the more sadly famous part of the story. So for Cain, we got a little bit of a description about why his mother named him what he did. And this also sets a precedent that a lot of times you'll see the lady picking the name for the child. So that was a very common custom, just as it was to trace the lineage through the firstborns or through the at least most suited oldest inheritor that was a man, if at all possible, if there were kids that fit the criteria to pass the torch down to and to become a leader also of the family or the tribe or clan. So we have now Cain and his brother Abel. Cain's the oldest, obviously. And it doesn't make a note about Abel saying anything about his name, But in the Net Bible, which I've talked about a few times, there's a footnote, and I'm gonna talk about this because it kind of leaves a little bit of a cliffhanger for something we can expect in future episodes when we talk about what ends up happening to Abel in the future and what happens to his family line and all that kind of stuff, because we're going to go over family trees, genealogy kind of stuff that is to come in a little bit. And there's something that you'll notice. So, with that said, the scholar note says the name Abel is not defined here in the text, but the tone is ominous. Abel's name, the Hebrew word havel, means breath, vapor, or vanity, foreshadowing Abel's untimely, and I won't finish the sentence because that'll be a little bit of a giveaway. And I've given away a lot of stuff in advance, but for people who are coming to the Bible for the first time, I want it to be a surprise. Everyone else, you know what ends up happening, so we'll go over that in a future week. But let's switch gears and talk about their work. So, obviously, God made the man to do work. So, obviously, that's going to pass down to his kids. They're going to have to find their own jobs and not much competition in the market. So, Abel, it says that he was a shepherd of flocks. So there's a lot of different ways that you can translate it, but it's all the same thing. Basically, it's the term that he pastured flocks. So sometimes flocks is translated as sheep, like he pastured sheep, but it could include other animals such as goats and possibly even cattle. So it is a broader term to envelop the whole category of flocks. And when it says pastured, basically it means to shepherd. And so he was shepherd of flocks. And so we actually have a term that, especially people speaking other languages, you can kind of catch the connection that this is where we get the term pastor from, because pastor, or you could even think, let's say in Spanish, literally just say it in Espanol as pastor, and it literally means shepherd. So the same word for pastor, which also sounds like the word pasture, all of it is one and the same. So languages are interesting, and that's actually one of my hobbies. I spend a lot of time studying languages on the side, and obviously I do spend time studying the Hebrew as well as when I study the New Testament, also the Greek. And then I also enjoy other things on the side, like Chinese, and I've been getting into Norwegian. I know some Spanish, and I'm not fluent in anything else, but that's distracting from the topic. Just wanted to share a little bit about myself since I've been doing 20 something episodes and haven't really shared a whole lot about myself, but that's one of my hobbies and interests. So, with that said about the term pastor or shepherd, so basically he's taking care of the flock. That's Abel's job. So then we also got Cain's job. It said that he was a tiller of the ground, but basically, if you translate it literally, it means servant or worker of the ground. And so, kind of like it was said to Adam, he took after, in a way, his father's job, which is working the plants on the ground, since we'll see in the next verses, because they're about to bring an offering to God, which we're going to read about next. But essentially, Cain was a farmer and Abel was a shepherd. If you want to put it in modern job terms. So Abel was in charge of the animals, Cain was in charge of the flocks. And now we come to verse 3. So we're just going to read the rest of the verses 3 through 5. It says, "And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell." So there's a term there at the end. Let's just start out with that so you get the big picture. A countenance is basically a fancy old word for the term face. So his face dropped, but obviously it doesn't mean that his face melted and started drooping. It literally means that his facial expressions dropped. So he essentially got angry, and when you frown, your face kind of falls a little bit. So it's just a expression and term that they used for that. And we'll talk about the significance of that next episode, because we're going to be covering what happens after this fact, because this is the very first offering that's presented in the Bible, and it says that God approved and appreciated of Abel's offering, but not of Cain's. So, why is God rejecting Cain's offering? That's kind of hard to catch there. Like, it doesn't really give all the reasons why. Is it literally just because he likes the meat and the fat better, and so he approved and liked Abel's offering better? Like, what's so bad about Cain's offering? Like, he offered him what he was producing, right? So what's the problem here? So now let's go into more Bible studying and critical reading, which by that I don't mean getting critical and dismissing everything it has to say before you even look at it and give it a chance, or taking such a critical lens that you're skeptical and will never come to terms with what it's saying, even if there's good evidence. What I'm talking about is just digging deep and analyzing what it is saying and picking apart the intricate details like we have been doing this whole time. So, with that said, what does it actually say here? So, basically, some time has passed. It says, in the process of time, it came to pass. So, after a while, after some time, they had been doing their work. It says that Cain brought an offering of fruit of the ground. So let's take a look at that. First off, it doesn't say that God rejected it right away. It simply says that he offered fruit of or from the ground to Yahweh. So we can at least check the box that he's offering it to the right God, so there's no problem there. But at the same time, like, is there a problem with it specifically being fruit? or with it being not an animal or something, because we're going to talk about Abel, who was a shepherd and he didn't offer fruit, he offered the animals. So, what was different about his offering? So, let's talk about his, because I guess it's kind of a cliffhanger. It doesn't really say why yet that God, and it doesn't even say at this point that God had rejected the offering. So Cain offers his offering. I don't know if he was thinking that there might have been something wrong or it wasn't his best or he should have been offering something different, but he offers it with or without thinking much about it. And it says that Abel brought the firstborn of the flock and the fat. So, with that, what do you notice that's different about the offering? So, there's a term that maybe could have been synonymously used with Cain's offering with the fruit. So, it says that Abel offered the firstborn of his flock. So, now we're sure like they both offered from the work that they were producing. So obviously, Abel was producing flocks through his work. Cain was producing fruit from his work. I don't think God had any problem with either one of those jobs. So I don't think that it was necessarily the source of their work that was the problem, but there could have been a source of the product or maybe the way that the product was offered. So, what does it say specifically about the kind of flock? So, dig a little deeper and check out the word before flock. It says the firstborn of the flock. So, just as I was telling you guys earlier about how the firstborn are the most important, even when it comes to things like animals, the firstborn was still important. So, with that, it's kind of saying at the same time that Abel offered the very first and best of his flock. So, before he could have a bunch of his flock to look at and say, which one is in the worst condition? So I end up sacrificing the least valuable so I can keep all the rest of the most valuable for myself. No, he offered the firstborn right away. Maybe he thought about it and he was tempted to offer something secondhand, but I think that it's possible when it says that he did that and the fat. So the fat could have been used for food. It could have also been used for just cooking in general. And yet he ended up sacrificing either the whole animal or the portions of the animal, including their fat. And with that said, he basically gave up the most valuable thing that he had, his firstborn. And on top of that, also, it may have been multiple firstborns because there probably were several different families or herds of flocks within the flock that he took care of. So it's possible that it could have been even more than one, but it was the most valuable thing that he had, the fat and the firstborn. So qualitatively, he offered the most valuable thing that he had. And so it says that Yahweh looked on Abel and his offering, and some say he looked favorably. Technically, it just says that he looked at, which when the Bible says that, like he looked and he saw it as valuable, because when you end up going to a store and you end up looking at something, it means that there's something that you like about it and it's attractive to you. And so this offering is favorable and attractive to God. Like he appreciates the heart and the sacrifice and the effort that Cain is putting into it. So another way that you could say he looked at is he took notice of. Then when we go to verse 5, which, like we've talked about, the verse markers didn't originally exist and they're put there for our convenience to follow along easier. But it says that for Cain, that his offering was not seen or respected. So God didn't take notice of Cain's offering. So does it mean that he was upset at Cain and that Cain did not do things right and God was angry at him? Or does it mean that his was not up to par? God just passed it by and didn't even take notice of it because Abel's was better? Did God have respect, as some versions say, for Abel's offering, but not for Cain's? And you know, if we have just this text, we could go to some commentaries and see what other sort of people and scholars and even people in rabbinic traditions, which those are the Hebrew teachers, have to say about the topic. But I think we can actually use the rest of the whole Bible to our advantage, because actually there are some other verses that kind of give us some hints. But first, I wanted to, before we do that, go back into Cain and his offering. I just wanted to point out a few things that might have been superior or subpar about Cain's offering. First off, we talked about Abel's was the firstborn. I don't know if you've heard the term first fruits, but Cain's offering was not the first fruits. At least it doesn't say that it was. So if Cain would have offered the first fruits, would like the quality and the best of his stuff have been enough and satisfactory for God to not pass over it and look past his what seemed like either a forgettable or disrespectful sacrifice that he made? Also, I wanted to point out how it says that the fruit came from the ground. Obviously, all fruit stems from a plant that comes from the ground. Yet at the same time, at least when I was reading it, I was curious, is there some kind of connection between like the, I guess, dirtiness of the ground and how the ground is not seen as a good thing, kind of like as we've been talking about, like it's cursed. So technically animals also live on the ground, so in a way Abel's kind of also tending to the earth, the ground, stuff in the world, the animals on the earth. But at the same time, like, number one, is there maybe a problem because maybe the fruit actually was literally on the ground and he offered the worst quality stuff Have you ever went to an apple orchard or some other kind of orchard and picked fruits and you were like, all of these really nice fruits in the tree, but I'm gonna go and look on the ground and see if there's anything that I can find that's of not as good quality. Oh, here we go. This will make a perfect sacrifice to God. Then I won't have to use the best stuff I have in the trees. Or maybe he didn't find something from the ground, but he could have been finding less than desirable products from his plants. So, this is a possibility that I was thinking of because it doesn't really say why his was not seen, but Abel's was. And I think that the quality was very clearly pointed out for Abel, like it was his firstborn, but it doesn't necessarily say Cain's was the first fruits. So, with that said, that could have been a main factor. There's only one other argument that I've heard, which is that even though Cain was working the fields and working with fruit and plants, at the same time, God may have still been requiring him to sacrifice animals, so he might have had to buy one of his brother's animals to be able to sacrifice it, and maybe he got lazy because that might have been the required type of sacrifice. And so, like, let's talk about sacrifices for a minute. It doesn't really give any information about them other than this is the very first time that we're seeing this. And so it said after some time that Cain brought fruit from the ground as an offering. And I also didn't mention earlier that the term offering could also be translated, and in some verses is used as the term present to like present something. And so both of them are presenting something to God. And so essentially they're giving gifts to God, and we're not sure what kind of sacrifice or offering or gift or present this was to Yahweh, but it was obviously some kind of sacrifice that they were making. It could have been what is known as a sin offering. I don't know if they had been committing sins and God laid it on their heart, or maybe there were interactions, or maybe even other cultures that were starting to spring up at the time. Maybe there were other children, either from Adam and Eve, or maybe there actually were other humans on the earth at the time that were doing sacrifices and things of that sort. And so it's possible that they got the idea like, hey, we're going to do this to God. And it could have been, like I said, a sin offering for something that they did wrong. It could have been a peace offering, which is not when there's necessarily anything wrong, but that it's just to stay in good grace and say thank you to God for the produce, literally the fruits and or the flocks that God had given them, and just saying thank you to God. And this was a pretty big custom. We know even in early history there were sacrifices. So it's very clear and obvious that it's being literal about them making some kind of sacrifice. We just don't know exactly which kind or what kind it was. But I wanted to come back to a point I was about to make. One other sort of theory that I've heard is that, like I was saying a minute ago, that God may have been requiring a meat or animal sacrifice from Cain, even though he didn't work with them. He still could have gotten his hands on some kind of animal to make a sacrifice, and maybe even a specific kind of animal, like a sheep, a lamb, a goat, or whatever kind would have been applicable, either as God told them was fit, or that he knew intuitively was fit for whatever kind of sacrifice or occasion it was. So there is a verse in the book of Hebrews, chapter 9, verse 22, that says, "In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness." So some people believe that this verse infers that the only legit kind of sacrifice to apply to a sin offering, or when someone messes up or does evil or bad or wrong, that the only way to have it forgiven and to have them cleansed was by blood and by animal sacrifice. And obviously they don't want to sacrifice themselves. Like, they could say, I've done wrong, I don't deserve to live anymore, I'm going to kill myself for the sake of justice and the good of everyone. Imagine if everyone did that, put themselves out of existence because they realized that they were too evil and dangerous. Well, we would not have anyone in the world. And so they used animals to represent and push the blame off from them onto the animal. And just as they deserve to die for whatever wrong they did, they put that onto the animal and end up killing them. Because remember, Adam and Eve disobeying God, he said that they would die. And when we disobey God, we are going to and we deserve to die. And obviously, we're all okay with the fact that nature is one day going to put an end to us. But how come so many people get upset with God for fair reasons, saying, hey, I'm going to have to put a stop and an end to you? We're okay with the justice system. We're okay with nature putting an end to us. But for some reason, there's many people who have a problem with the God who created them and knows best, with him saying, hey, what you did is wrong. Like, you don't deserve to keep on living in this beautiful world that I gave you. It was given to us as a gift in the first place. And if we disrespect God and his laws, if we don't listen to his instructions, like, hey, don't eat from this tree, or maybe God off script, away from the Bible and other writings, had some kind of law and code for people to offer sacrifices. Did Adam and Eve offer sacrifices because of their sin to God? The answer is, I don't know, because it doesn't say. And that's going to be the answer a lot. But what we're dealing with right here and now is Cain and Abel's offering. And it's possible that Cain didn't do it the right way. Obviously, he didn't do it exactly the proper way. And God was not being trivial. There had to have been some sort of good reason that he didn't take notice of Cain's offering, probably because Cain's offering was not respectable, and no one likes disrespectful, obviously, including God. And so that was one of the theories, and I wanted to throw that out there because there's quite a bit of people who hold to this view. And so, whether you think it was the quality or the specific type of thing that was sacrificed, or maybe there was even another reason or factor that we don't even know to take into consideration that was at play here. The fact is that God does not appreciate Cain's offering. And so, picking up where we left off in the middle of verse 5, it says that Cain was angry and he dropped his face or his countenance. There's a million ways you could say it. Let's take a look in some of the parallels. It says, his face was downcast. He looked dejected. In the English Standard Version, it says, his face fell. I like that one. His countenance fell is from the Berean Standard. The King James says, and his countenance fell. So we can see there's a few different ways to see this, and the New American Standard says that his face was gloomy. So it's very clear what it means that he was upset. So the question is, does he have reason to be upset at God? Is God being unfair about like noticing Abel's sacrifice? Did he just like pass over Cain's, even though Cain did offer something good? Like, is God being bogus to him? Or does Cain just have an attitude, and even though he knew he didn't fully offer a good offering, he's still upset anyways? Because how many people do you know they do something wrong and then they get upset at other people for being upset at them? I've seen it one too many times working at a rescue mission. I work with guys who have come from drug and alcohol backgrounds in the past, and them working to get clean, it brings out a lot of emotions, and who knows what kind of attitude or maybe even mental problems or what other kind of issues Cain could have had in his life, resentment towards his brother, maybe. I don't know, maybe he formed that for the first time because God approved of his brother's stuff, but not his. It just is easy to get upset and not to look at our own work and self reflect of whether or not we did a good job with something. It's easy to be upset at other people when things don't go our way. And that's true of almost all of us as humans. But I want to wrap up and leave off with what we were reading at the end, where it says that his face fell. There's no perfect way again to say this in English, but the fact that he got upset and it could be seen on his face when we have stuff that's going on inside, everyone knows that you can see a lot of stuff inside on the outside. For example, if I'm nervous, you can see the inside of me by taking a look at me tapping my foot and twiddling my fingers, and I could be making some uncomfortable head movements, and you get the picture. So that's what we'll be talking about next time, is the implications and the connection between how our face can tell us a lot more about the inside state of our soul, and also our intentions. And so we'll talk about that next time. Hey, I'm so glad you guys could join for today's podcast. I hope things clicked for you and that you're able to better understand God's word. Jesus said, "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. So keep on listening to what God has to say, and I'll see you guys next time. God bless.